Hi. For class on Friday, we are going to be talking about the stories of Abraham. So we've had in Genesis, we've seen Genesis, the first 10 chapters of Genesis, which is this kind of universal history. Where do human beings come from? Why do we speak all these different languages? The universal flood. Then we start off with something quite different in chapter 12, which is the life of Abraham, this single person and his wife Sarah, who are called away from um, uh, the what we now would call Iraq. They come across the Fertile Crescent to um, what is today Palestine, Israel and Palestine, and they are Abraham is brought by a promise that God gives him. That's at the very beginning of chapter 12. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. So there's this promise that a nation will come from Abraham. And really, the rest of the Hebrew Bible is going to be playing out this basic idea that um, Abraham is going to will eventually have a child, as you'll see, and those children, there will be children after that, and their number will grow, and they will become a nation. And God is going to have a special relationship with that nation, and that is really at the core of Judaism and ancient Israelite religion. Um, so we've got you can think of the rest of the Hebrew Bible as really a narrative in some ways, playing out that story of God and his relationship to his people. We've got Abraham and the kind of patriarchal era, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the 12 tribes, right? This is kind of these early stories of God working with the beginnings of his people. His people go to Egypt, and they're called out of Egypt, and that's perhaps the most dramatic story in the Hebrew Bible, the Exodus. And I'll have you writing about that and working on your next essay on Saturday on the story of the Exodus, really a central event in the Hebrew Bible. After the people of Israel get settled in the land, that's they become a monarchy, a little state, a kingdom. Um, David, Solomon are the big names you'd associate with that period of time. So that's a couple centuries. And then we get exile. So there's other larger countries that are around Israel. The Assyrians come and send the northern kingdom, the northern tribes, into exile. And then the big one is in 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire comes and sack Jerusalem, take all its leaders and religious and state-wise, take them into exile. And so Israel as a state, as a nation, is destroyed. They're taken into exile for 70 years. And then the tail end of what we have as the Hebrew Bible, we see that there's a return to the land. So leaders that had been in exile, their children and their children's children are finally able to come back and reestablish worship in the temple in Jerusalem. Right, so this is the narrative, and there's a huge amount of reflection. And the Hebrew Bible, as we know it, was put together in that period when the people of Israel were coming back to Jerusalem and reestablishing their state and their worship. So there's a lot of even though the stories are much earlier, there's a lot of reflection on those later events. How could God do this? How does God work in history? Even the story of Genesis in Eden, some people take as being kind of a little bit of a reflection on that we had our place, it was perfect that God gave us, and we lost it. What did we do to lose that? Why did that happen? Right? And so even stories that seem to be pushed way back in time at their heart are really about things that happened several centuries later. Other material, so there's historical material, but then there's also other things too, like the Psalms. And the bulk of the Psalms are examples of the worship in ancient Israel, what was sung in the temple. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Psalms next week. And then there's also the prophets, people with a message from God who often are kind of coming in against the rulers and against the kings. And that's something else that we'll read next week. But all this material in the Hebrew Bible you can think of as the story, the kind of expansive, multi-platform story of God working with his chosen people, the Jews. All right. Eventually, Judaism is going to kind of develop out of what we have in these texts. And that's a bit of a story I'll try to tell. But what you're going to be working on for Saturday is, first of all, you're going to read the chapters in Exodus, which all you have to do is read Exodus 1 through 15, which is the story of Moses, the plagues, and then leading the people of Israel out of Egypt into the promised land, right? So that's the first 15 chapters. Now the ritual in Judaism of Passover, really the central feast, central ritual in Judaism, is based on the Passover. But they're different too. We have on the one hand a story, which takes a number of chapters and has a lot of details. And then the other hand, we have a ritual. And to help you understand the ritual, I put up a YouTube clip where there's a woman who's kind of explaining what the Passover is and how it's celebrated. If you have more questions, feel free to, there's tons of people on YouTube who want to tell you about what the Passover is and how to celebrate it. So, but there's one that I put up there that 5 minutes long that you can watch. And what I want you to speculate on is, what is the relationship between text and ritual? All right. And you'll see, I think, that it's not a one-to-one correspondence. So there's stuff in the Passover that's related to the story. There's stuff in the story that's not in the Passover. How would you kind of compare? What is the connection between scripture and story, and then the living ritual that a religious group actually practices? And be theoretical. You know, I like on these essays to ask expansive questions that don't make you kind of find a right or wrong answer, but make you kind of stare at the material for a little bit and think about that. Think about the question. And to the extent that I see you kind of working through it and kind of speculating and coming up with an answer, I'm going to be happy. So here's the question: what's the relationship between story in scripture and living ritual that you find in religious traditions like Judaism? All right, that's what I want to see some reflection on for essay number 3. Thanks, and I'll see you tomorrow morning for Friday, and some of you might watch this after that class.